This is A Verse, a podcast about poetry for the lovers and the loathers. A podcast about life, words, beauty, nature, love, loathing, longing, loss, rhythm and rhyme, about everything and nothing and all that falls between. Last week was a banner week for poetry in the United States. At the inauguration of President Biden, a 22-year-old performance poet named Amanda Gorman delivered a poem that lit up the internet. It certainly lit me up. What was it about her poem that struck so many of us? Certainly part of the impact was her performance, her demeanor, her radiance, the hope of youth. The beauty of her message and the way she spoke it evoked its vision, which in turn invoked our hearts, asking them to listen deeply and then to step into her imagined future for us all. Here were some of the words that really struck me. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. I love the promise in those words, not seeing ourselves as broken, but rather as works in progress. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. The play on words there, asking each of us to choose which kinds of arms we want to carry. The arms that fire and destroy, or the arms that embrace and include. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we hurt, we hoped. That even as we tired, we tried. That we'll forever be tied together victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. What a call to action. You know, our worlds are built on paradox. The both and of being human, and yet in every paradox lies a choice. She is asking us to choose between two seeming opposites. But when we do, she writes, one thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy. Oh my gosh, those words leapt off the screen that morning last week as I watched Gorman speak, because if there is anything I've learned in my life, it is that love is our only legacy. Nothing else lasts. We may remember the hatred and the brutality of history as object lessons, but all we are fundamentally capable of carrying forward in our hearts is love. If we cannot live in love, we leave nothing of ourselves to be carried in the hearts of those we have hoped to love in this world. And so she ends with, when the day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. She leaves us all asking ourselves, will I be brave enough to see it, to be it, to see and be the light of hope? Although poetry flies under the radar most of the time in our modern, prosaic world, ever since the election of President Kennedy, poetry like Gorman's bursts into prominence occasionally, and we, I believe, are all the better for it. Counting last week, there have been 6 poems read at 6 inaugural ceremonies, beginning with Robert Frost at President Kennedy's inauguration. Back in 1961, Robert Frost was regarded as the great poet of the common man. He was also the poet of New England, from whence the Kennedy family hailed, and poems such as The Road Not Taken became touchstones for America. Frost didn't step into prominence until his 40s, but by the time he stood on the steps of the Capitol, he was America's unofficial poet laureate. Interestingly, however, the poem Frost read wasn't the poem he prepared. Apparently, the snow was so bright that he couldn't read what he had written for the glare on the page, and so he spoke instead a poem he knew by heart. The poem that Frost spoke and the one he had prepared are not poems that necessarily land well on us in the 21st century. They're poems that invoke American bravado and masculinity and manifest destiny. One of the lines in the poems he had prepared but did not speak was, "Glory is out of date in life and art." And yet, the poem feels full of just such out-of-date glory, with lines such as, "Courage is in the air in bracing whiffs, a democratic form of right divine. There is the call to life a little sterner and braver for the earner, learner, yearner. The glory of a next Augustan age, of a power leading from its strength and pride, of young ambition eager to be tried, a golden age of poetry and power, of which this noonday's the beginning hour." What a contrast between Frost and his glory, his masculine glory, and Gorman's more sobering view of our current bitter but not broken America. And so it's not Frost's words that are most interesting to me, but rather that he ended up speaking the words he knew. And he knew them because poetry is verbal. We hear the words of poetry in our head, and this is because poetry is meant to be spoken. One of my favorite contemporary poets is David Whyte, and he speaks the poems he writes so that you really hear them, often repeating the lines so that they go in more deeply. Because, as he teaches, when words are repeated, we remember them. When words are repeated, we remember them. This is how some of the greatest epic poems that were also stories, were passed down. The Iliad and the Odyssey, told, not written. One of my favorite poems about the remembering of poems, what took place during the repressive and brutal Stalin regime of the Soviet Union, where millions of people were either imprisoned or murdered. The beloved Russian poet Anna Akhmedova wrote a poem about this time called Requiem, and she worked on this poem over 3 decades. She carried it with her as she moved all across the Soviet Union, fleeing persecution. Her story is amazing. Beloved as a poet, Stalin couldn't risk attacking her directly, so he made her life a misery. Not only did he prevent her from publishing, but her first husband was executed. Then her second husband died from tuberculosis. Her third husband died in prison, and her son was imprisoned several times. She herself contracted typhus and tuberculosis and lost touch with her family. She was labeled half harlot, half a nun, and the secret police kept her under constant surveillance. When her son was in prison, she stood, along with countless other women, in line outside prison walls, women who, like her, waited patiently, but with a sense of immense grief and powerlessness, for just the chance to send a loaf of bread or a message to their husbands or sons or partners. So Requiem, which is the poem she wrote about this time over that huge period of time, wasn't published in Russia until its entirety, until 1987. But the poem was begun during the time of her son's arrest. And during that time, because even the smallest scrap of paper could become evidence against her, she couldn't write the poem down. So the poem was kept by a small group of friends who memorized it for her. One of those friends, Lydia Chukovskaya, herself a poet, and an editor, publicist, and memoirist, later recalled, "Suddenly in mid-conversation, she would fall silent, and signaling me with her eyes at the ceiling and walls, she would get a scrap of paper and a pencil. Then she would loudly say something very mundane, like, 'Would you like some tea?' Then she would cover the scrap in hurried handwriting and pass it to me. I would read the poems, and having memorized them, would hand them back to her in silence. 'How early the autumn came this year,' she would say loudly, to foil anyone listening, and striking a match would burn the paper over an ashtray." Isn't that the most amazing story? And so a kind of whisper network preserved these poems of these poets, and the original writings were burned so that they couldn't be found. Requiem opens with a prose introduction describing her experience of standing in line outside of a prison for 17 months waiting for the news of her son. It's called Instead of a Preface. During the terrifying years of the Yezhov repressions, I spent 17 months in Leningrad prison lines. One time, someone thought they recognized me. Then a woman standing behind me, who of course had never heard my name, stirred from her own, though common to all of us, stupor, and asked in my ear, there all spoke in a whisper, "Could you describe this?" "I can." Then something akin to a smile slipped across what once had been her face. April 1st, 1957, Leningrad. So this poem was co-created, as all poetry ultimately is. Toward the end of the poem, Akhmedova writes, "No matter what, I was prepared I would survive with this some way. I have so many things to do today. I must slaughter memory to the end. I need for my soul to turn to stone. I must once again relearn to live. I have so many things to do today. Not go to work or buy groceries or pick up kids from soccer practice, but stand in a prison line in the bitter cold and slaughter memory and turn her soul to stone and relearn to live." She wrote, "So that now I pray not for myself alone, but for all of us who stood there with me. In that intense cold and in July's heat under that red and blinded wall." And she finishes by saying, "If they ever in this our country consider erecting to me a monument, I give my wholehearted consent, but with one condition. Do not put it by the sea where I was born. My last connection with the sea is torn. Not in Tsar's garden by the famous stump where an unrequited shade searches for me, but here, where I stood 300 hours, and where for me the gate opened never." Poetry unites us, as Amanda Gorman showed us, just as prayer unites us when we remember that we all pray to the same God as love. And so Akhmedova prayed not for herself alone, but for everyone who stood in that line with her. And she dedicated the poem and wrote the poem with everyone. And so when a statue to her was finally erected in 2006, it was across the river from that notorious prison to mark the 40th anniversary of her death. And the inscription contains a line of her poem. You see, I believe poetry preserves our history in a way that colors outside the lines of black and white male-dominated to the victor go the spoils schoolbook history. And that's why these lines from Elizabeth Alexander, spoken at Barack Obama's first inauguration, meant so much to everyone, but particularly to the African-American people watching the first African-American president take office. Alexander spoke, "Say it plain, that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices they would then keep clean and work inside of. Praise song for struggle, praise song for the day, praise song for every hand-lettered sign, the figuring it out at the kitchen table." Poetry is a praise song, to be sure. Which is why Maya Angelou's poem at the inauguration of Bill Clinton in 1993 was so memorable. Hers is a praise song to all the people who brought America to that moment. Each of you, descendant of some past on traveler, has been paid for. You who gave me my first name, you Pawnee, Apache, Seneca, you Cherokee Nation who rested with me, then forced on bloody feet, left me to the employment of other seekers, desperate for gain, starving for gold. You, the Turk, the Arab, the Swede, the German, the Eskimo, the Scot, you, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the crew, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on the nightmare, praying for a dream. Here, root yourself beside me. Here, on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope. Good morning. Praise song, prayer, psalm, all poems lift our thoughts higher than our poor thought models allow to something bigger than all of us, so that we can sing it out in praise that reminds us of what is really true. And so we come to our last poem of this podcast. On the evening of President Biden's inauguration, he and Tom Hanks joined together to read Biden's favorite poem. A stutterer as a young man, Biden spoke poetry to help retrain himself to speak, and he particularly loves Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet who continued the great ancient tradition of the Irish bards. As a poet from Northern Ireland, Heaney used his work to reflect upon the troubles, the often violent political struggles that plagued the country during his youth and young adulthood, and he sought to weave those ongoing troubles into a broader historical frame that tied into the larger human situation. And so when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, it was for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. I believe his poems resonate to the great stories we all carry inside us. And the poem which Biden and Hanks spoke and to which Biden often refers to in these troubled times is called The Cure of Troy. When I was a little girl, my father shared the story of Troy with me, not just the story told by Homer in the poetry of the war and the famous Trojan horse or the wanderings of Odysseus, but also of how, as the centuries passed, people began to believe Troy was just a legend, that the real Troy had never existed. And so my dad told me about a little German boy who loved that story and became so obsessed with it that he was determined one day to find Troy. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. And he did find Troy. And he is regarded as the father of contemporary archaeology, though, of course, as with all things, there is some dispute now about his means of excavation. But in college, I had a friend named Philip who was German-American, and a friend of his visited him in college, and he and I became friends. So that summer, I went to visit them both, and I got to go to this friend's house. And it was this beautiful estate on the Elbe River. And I met his mother, and she gave me a tour of the house. And as I was walking around, I was blown away by the artifacts. I mean, they were like museum-quality artifacts. I grew up with beautiful things in my home, and this home just blew my mind. And so I said that much to Philip as an aside, like, oh my God, the things in here, like, they should be in a museum. And he looked at me like I was the village idiot. Apparently, when he had told me his friend's name, it hadn't clicked. His name was Schliemann. He was the descendant of the man who had rediscovered Troy. And I was looking at artifacts from Troy. But anyway, I always think of that with Troy. So back to the poem, although I won't apologize for the digression because life and poetry and this podcast are all filled with digressions. The Cure of Troy begins. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on the side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Heaney begins this poem with a wallop, but it is this darkness, this deep suffering, and then the hope we come to out of it that Biden keeps invoking and asking all of us to feel. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracles self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. And if there's fire on a mountain, and lightning and storm, and God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime, that justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. I'm going to leave you just to ponder how at this time we can believe that instead of this being all the worst, it is an opportunity for us all to bring everything that has been so broken, that has been so flawed, to the surface for all of us to see. Because there's fire on the mountain and lightning and storm, and God speaks from the sky because we are being heard, and new life is forming. Once in a lifetime, our lifetime, hope and history can rhyme. But going back to Amanda Gorman, we all must choose. We must choose whether we have the courage and the bravery to see it and to be it, for there is always light. So thank you for listening to A Verse, a podcast about poetry, about life and loss and longing. This is a podcast for the poetry lovers and loathers. Let's invoke hope and history.